Good morning, good day, and good afternoon to all. I am Listra Antoine, Program Manager in the Global Engagements Unit of the Food and Agriculture Global Practice at the World Bank, and today I'll be your moderator. Just to ensure that we are all in the right place, today's webinar will address the CFS Voluntary Guidelines on Food Systems and Nutrition, and it's entitled Translating Ambition to Action. And today is Wednesday, June 16, 2021. And so we'll run for the next hour and a half, just around. And before I continue, most of you would have seen the housekeeping guidelines, but I just want to reiterate that we're kindly asking you to mute yourselves when you're not speaking, just to protect bandwidth as well. We're asking you to keep your cameras off, except for our panelists and speakers. The webinar will be recorded. The flow language is English. And today we have now close to 100 participants on the call. So welcome one and all. These participants hail from the World Bank, from the UN organizations, FAO, WHO, governments, ministries, and embassies, development organizations, civil society, the private sector, and academia. So we're really thrilled that you've all taken the time to be with us today. And our program is timed so that we can hear and interact from you. But if you have any questions and comments, what we ask is that you place and use the chat, the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions or comments to us. Feel free to identify to whom you would want the question to be addressed, and we will try to ensure that we save enough time toward the end of our webinar today, the last 25 minutes, to have an interactive session with you. So with that, the speakers would be able to respond. So a little background on the CFS, the Committee for Food Security. The World Bank Group is an advisory group member of the Rome-based Committee on World Food Security. This Committee on World Food Security formally adopted the Voluntary Guidelines on Food Systems and Nutrition on February 10th of this year during the 47th plenary session of the CFS. The adoption followed a 5-year inclusive multi-stakeholder consultative and negotiation process that was informed by the scientific evidence of the CFS high-level panel of experts. These guidelines aim to promote policy coherence and reduce policy fragmentation between relevant sectors, including health, agriculture, education, environment, gender, social protection, trade, and employment, each impacting food systems and nutrition. The voluntary guidelines for food systems and nutrition will be used to support the development of coordinated, multi-sectoral national policies, laws, programs, and investment plans to enable safe and healthy diets through sustainable food systems. The guidelines include a range of recommendations for actions to promote transparent and accountable governance, sustainable food supply chains, access to healthy diets, food safety across sustainable food systems in humanitarian contexts. Now, we also have and understand that they are really a tool in the hands of governments, UN agencies, civil society, private sector, financial institutions, and other development actors to shape policies and interventions that address malnutrition in all its forms using a holistic food systems approach. So this webinar today seeks to raise awareness about the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, its substantive content, and how best to promote utilization of the guidelines at regional, country, and local levels. Today's webinar will emphasize the usefulness of the tool in the design and implementation of projects aiming to transform or strengthen food systems. It will also explore the World Bank's potential support via its loans, grants, investments, and technical assistance and knowledge programs, and also encourage all stakeholders, in particular governments and donors, to leverage ongoing and new programs to transform food systems for achieving sustainable food systems and improved nutrition. And now let me turn you over to Martin van Nieuwkoop, our Global Director, Agriculture and Food Global Practice of the World Bank, for his introductory remarks. Martin, thank you for joining us today. And over to you, Martin.
Very good. Thank you very much, Lisa, for this introduction, and a warm welcome. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all the speakers and participants. As you say, you know, the title of the webinar is Moving from Ambitions Towards Action. So I want to particularly focus in my introductory remarks on actions and actually what can the World Bank do to actually kind of bring forward, some of the issues that are actually included in the guidelines, the voluntary guidelines for food and nutrition. I think this is relevant. The World Bank provides about $4 billion in agriculture and food financing every year. Our portfolio is about north of $20 billion. So this is a significant chunk of investments taking place every year. So I think I want to kind of reflect a little bit on, how is the bank's operating environment evolving, and are there any entry points actually that provide, some opportunities to bring forward the agenda of the voluntary guidelines, as well as, what's happening at the country engagement level, evolving lending and portfolio that provides entry points. So let me first start with the operating environment. I think the first point I would like to make is that the bank has fully adopted a food systems approach. This means that the bank's engagement on agriculture and food is very much focused on creating conditions of a transformation of the food systems in a way that it contributes to healthy people, healthy planet, and a healthy economy. In that context, there's a lot of attention, to the hidden cost of the global food system. Calculations have been done, and clearly, when you look at the kind of the makeup of those hidden costs, the big chunk, the biggest proportion actually is associated with the kind of the health cost of the hidden health cost of the global food system associated with undernutrition, malnutrition, people being overweight and obese. Overall, hidden costs of the food system are estimated about $12 trillion per year. The ones associated with health, more than 50% of those. So that's the first point. The second point is that with COVID-19, the attention to food and nutrition security is now clearly on the radar screen of bank senior management and the board. Actually, we're preparing, for a briefing to the board on Friday that the board has asked for, reflecting this heightened attention. There's a lot of concern in this respect. That the reduction in incomes and the higher food prices that we see is causing consumers to shift, the demand towards basic food grains and away from the more nutritious food. So it's actually affecting the quality of people's diets, and there are deep concerns. That 3 billion people can actually not afford a healthy diet, estimated at $3.75 a day, which also raises questions about to what extent the absolute poverty line of $1.90 is fully adequate. So I think that's a second important observation. The third observation when it comes to the bank's operating environment is that, since the last 2-3 years, a very kind of dedicated focus on human capital and working with our clients to make sure that they capture the full economic benefits of investing in human capital. Clearly, of course, there's a clear link between nutrition and human capital, and that also has raised the profile of nutrition, I think, in the bank. And then a fourth reflection on the bank's kind of evolving operating environment is the climate change action plan, the new climate change action plan that will be discussed at the board and adopted by the board tomorrow. a lot of attention in the Climate Change Action Plan on a number of critical sectors that need to make a transition, to decarbonization. And in that respect, 5 systems have been identified and prioritized, and agriculture, food, and land use is one of those 5. And of course, we know, the link between, healthy diets, the carbon footprint. Typically what we see is that healthier diets actually have lower carbon footprints. So also in that context, I would see a lot more attention, to healthy people, nutrition, the agenda that's being put forward by the voluntary guidelines. So those are a few reflections on the operating environment, Lisa, that I think are relevant. Now, let me then move to the our engagement at the country level. A couple of observations there, what I see. One is with the rising food and nutrition insecurity that we have seen because of COVID-19, there's a lot of demand for a new mechanism that became effective a year ago as part of the IDA-19 launch. the early response financing, about $1 billion was set aside, for countries to kind of respond to health and food security emergencies. Up until now, about 13 countries have access and are eligible and are working and mobilizing those funds, and those funds have been mobilized. One condition, to access those funds is for those countries to put in place food security preparedness plans. And of course, I think those provide also kind of an opportunity. When we talk about food security preparedness plans, this is actually a broad stroke, and a kind of a big lens. This is not narrowly defined. So I could see opportunities also to bring in elements of nutrition and security, and by that, of course, elements of the voluntary guidelines, so that we can bring actually and put together a whole of aid approach, in those type of situations. So I see that as an opportunity where we probably can work together. Second is that the bank is a very active member of the Policy Action Coalition that was formed after, as part of the Just Rural Transition Initiative following the UN Climate Action Summit in September 2019. This Policy Action Coalition is focusing on repurposing public support to agriculture for better environmental, climate, and nutritional outcomes. In that respect, we're working very upstream with countries on their public expenditures and their policies. And what we see is that because of misguided self-sufficiency, food self-sufficiency policies, there's not necessarily a level playing field when it comes to access to basic grains and access to kind of the more nutritious food. Think about fruit and vegetables and animal protein. So how can we actually change the policy framework to provide actually better enabling conditions for the agenda put forward by the voluntary guidelines? Thirdly, we see a lot of demands, and of course this is also induced by our analytical work on the food safety agenda, a very big imperative. As you know, Lisa, since you work on that, kind of engage on that agenda. I think that provides another very important entry point, for the agenda put forward by the voluntary guidelines. And last but not least, we already have in place, a mechanism, in the agriculture and food global practice, where in our lending and our project, as I said, we do about $4 billion a year. We put a kind of a nutrition lens on it, to assess to what extent our projects are nutrition sensitive. According, to that lens, about 60% of the bank's investments in agriculture and food are nutrition sensitive. Now, of course, the voluntary guidelines have been, came out recently, earlier this year. So we could also see to what extent, this nutrition sensitive lens that we're applying to our new lending, takes fully account, of the issues put forward by the voluntary guidelines. So I think that provides another opportunities. Now, I'm sure there will be many more opportunities. So this is just a kind of an example, on how our operating environment and our country engagement actually provides entry points where we can move forward, the agenda put forward by the voluntary guidelines. I'm looking forward very much, to the presentations and the discussions to this effect. To see, how can we kind of take this agenda further and come up with some kind of concrete conclusion when it comes to translating those ambitions into action. So thank you very much. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Martine. I appreciate you really focusing on how we translate those ambitions into actions by focusing on the operating environment within the bank, and then especially on our engagements at the country level. So I'm going to move right into our introductory speaker. His name is Chris Hagedorn, and Chris is the Secretary of the Commission on World Food Security. Chris, as I did with Martine, I'm not going to go into the long introductions because we're a little bit behind time. I know all of our participants are able to see the bios. So without further ado, let me turn over to you for your opening remarks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Listra. Great to be here. I noticed the recording light is off, but the intention was to record, so you might check that is functioning. And Martine, great introduction. Always love hearing you speak. Always a rich portfolio of issues to cover, so thank you. I'm Chris Hagedorn, CFS Secretary. I'm based in Rome. We are hosted by FAO, but the CFS is co-owned, jointly managed, essentially by the three Rome-based agencies, FAO, WFP, and EFAD. And thank you for starting your day with us, those of you in Washington and North America. And particularly thanks to the World Bank, Astrid, and others who helped put this webinar together. We've got an incredible group of speakers, so we'll try to go through my points quickly and get on to the panel. As Leicester noted, the bank is a CFS advisory group member and has been since 2009, when CFS was completely overhauled and reformed. If you're new to CFS, what that reform witnessed was the creation of a CFS high-level panel of experts, and it brought in civil society, private sector, the CGIAR, the Rome-based agencies, and other UN agencies like WHO, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, the Secretariat of UN Nutrition, together to work jointly on global policy convergence products, all of which are targeted at SDG 2. So in this light, our key achievements over the past years include the CFS's voluntary guidelines on the progressive realization of the right to food, also our voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, an important, World Bank is an important player on that, the CFS RIE principles, responsible agriculture investment principles, 13 sets of policy recommendations, and just this year, as cited, the voluntary guidelines on food systems and nutrition, and 2 weeks ago, our policy recommendations on innovative approaches, agroecological and other. So the CFS high-level panel of experts has produced 15 outstanding reports so far, and will release its 16th report on youth on the 5th of July. So please look to our website and join us for that launch event. It will be another excellent report. So some of you may know us from our annual plenary meetings and vibrant side events, typically held in October. This year, because of the pandemic, we are hosting 3 plenary sessions, so it's incredibly busy. I invite you to join us 11 to 15 October for CFS 49, where we will be debating, among other things, our policy recommendations on water and separately on climate change, very relevant to what Martine was saying. I also encourage you to review our work on COVID-19 impacts on our website that supplement the fantastic work that the bank has done with its many reports. I also invite you to engage with us on our ongoing work stream on gender equality and women and girls empowerment, a separate work stream on data systems for food security and nutrition, and on inequalities, which is the 4th and last major topic in our current 4-year program of work. So why are we here? Malnutrition in all its forms is on the rise. We know we're off track in achieving SDG 2. We know malnutrition in all its forms, undernutrition, micronutrient deficiencies, overweight, obesity are increasing, and is something, are things that no country can ignore. The fiscal and social costs, or as Martine flagged, the hidden health costs, are simply too enormous for any country's policymakers and publics to ignore. So SOFI 2020 told us hunger is on the rise. Close to 700 million people chronically undernourished, 130 million pushed into hunger due to COVID-19, and even those figures are likely out of date. 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. Overweight and obesity are on the rise, which increase the risk of non-communicable diseases. Mira will talk about that. And 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. So not the most encouraging figures. But that's where CFS voluntary guidelines come in. To help reverse those trends, countries need policies and actions to transform food systems to deliver healthy diets, affordable healthy diets, improve nutrition while protecting biodiversity and the environment and sequestering carbon, as Martine pointed out. Our guidelines, which were adopted on 10 February, took place during increased attention by the global community on the links between food, health, nutrition, and the environment, adding to the work that's being done with the SDGs, the ICN2, UN Decade on Action on Nutrition, and of course the UN Food Systems Summit, which many of us are deeply engaged in. So our guidelines provide guidance on policies and interventions to address malnutrition in all its forms through a holistic food systems perspective that considers food systems in their totality and looks at the multi-dimensional causes of malnutrition. They result from an inclusive multi-stakeholder consultation and negotiation process, which is really what is unique and special about the CFS as the UN system's unique multi-stakeholder platform for addressing SDG 2. And they were informed by the scientific evidence of report number 12, which was done by a project team of the CFS high-level panel of experts. And we have Jess Fonzo, who led that team, to talk with us today. So the negotiations took over 300 hours. These are member state representatives in Rome with all the other parties involved at the table, negotiating every word of this lengthy and complex document that included governments, UN agencies, civil society, private sector, and others. And we consulted the zero draft in the 6 regional conference, 6 regions of the FAO: Europe, Africa, Asia, Near East, Latin America, and North America. So this was an intensive process which began actually more than 5 years ago. So this is a process that has benefited from the leadership of the Rome-based agencies, countries like Germany and Switzerland and others. So it's not a new thing. This wasn't something we thought of last year and decided to work on. This has been a long-term process benefiting from the HLP report. So these guidelines are a unique tool in the hands of policymakers and development experts and represent a multilaterally agreed global policy instrument on those connections between food systems and nutrition. And they provide newly agreed text on key concepts like healthy and unhealthy diets, nutritious foods, food systems, and sustainable food systems. I'm sure Maximo will talk about some of those in more detail. The document has 7 thematic areas. And it's a framework to promote policy coherence and coordination and to bring together various actors involved in the food systems. So the work of CFS does not finish with the approval of such policy tools. We need our members and stakeholders to make sure that the policy recommendations are adopted at global level and converted into concrete actions at regional, national, and local levels. And this is where I think the World Bank can provide such a huge boost through its network, through its $20 billion portfolio Martine pointed to promote the use of these VGs and make sure that policy coordination goes on at country level in particular, but is not duplicating work supported by different agencies, different donors, and reduces that policy fragmentation, which is always a challenge. So one of the objectives of today's session is not only to raise awareness about these guidelines, their substantive content and relevance to the bank and its programs. Our intention is to stimulate a discussion on how this can represent a tool to be used by bank staff and how utilization of our guidelines can be promoted at regional, country, and local levels through the bank's networks. So we look forward to learning from you and how we can partner more closely on this work. So with that, Listra, back to you, and we look forward to this great group of speakers. Thanks so much.
And thank you so much, Chris, for that overview. We really appreciate it. I mean, just impressive work by the CFS. And so now I'm going to turn to our key guest speakers. We have Dr. Jessica Fanzo from Johns Hopkins University. She's going to focus on what are the voluntary guidelines for food security and nutrition, the sort of the negotiations process and the main messages coming out of that. Dr. Maximo Torero Colin, Chief Economist of the Food and Agriculture Organization. He will focus on how to integrate these guidelines in the work of an international organization. And then we also would hear from Hedda Verberg, the UN Sun Movement Coordinator. She will focus on how to mobilize and establish network to bring the voluntary guidelines to the country level. And so I just want to make sure that I just said SUN. For those of you who are not familiar with the acronym, it's a Scaling Up Nutrition, and that's what Gerda is working on. With that, let me turn over. Now, I know we're running a bit late, and so I'm going to ask all of our speakers to be as concise as possible. Maximo, I know you had a time constraint. Is it okay still to leave you in the second position, or should I shift?
It's okay, no problem.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So we will start then with Jessica. Over to you, Jessica. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to CFS and the World Bank for organizing this session. I'm going to share my screen. And I was asked to do a presentation of what are the voluntary guidelines. And of course, Chris already outlined a bit of what they are. And of course, I'm coming more from academia, so I can be free to be a bit more provocative in my views. There was a real need to establish these guidelines. Evidence-based policymaking, of course, requires sound evidence, as many of you know. But many policymakers are in the dark on how to manage their food systems because food systems are so complex. So there's a need for guidelines, tools. Many of us on this call have developed tools that provide a roadmap for policy entry points within food systems for policymakers. And the voluntary guidelines are meant to do just that. They are a guiding roadmap for policymakers. But as Chris articulated, it's been a long and winding road to get to the voluntary guidelines. I said it was a 4-year process, but Chris, maybe you're right. Maybe it was a 5-year process. We started the high-level panel of experts report, which itself was a pretty grueling process to get to the final printing of this report. And one interesting recommendation of the many recommendations in the high-level panel of experts report was that the Committee on Food Security should develop voluntary guidelines on improving food environments for healthy diets. And it was very focused on food environments. Well, that, of course, has led into what we have now, the voluntary guidelines, which are much broader on overall food systems. And that in itself was a contentious decision that the CFS had to undergo to broaden the focus. So the guidelines do 3 things. They present a set of science and evidence-based guidelines to achieving healthy diets through sustainable food systems that address multiple outcomes of food systems. We ask food systems to do a lot for us. We want them to have economic growth, social equity, environmental outcomes, health and nutrition outcomes. So the guidelines focus on those broad set of outcomes. It also provides guidance on how would you actually implement these guidelines? What are the policies? Who are the people? What are the investments and the institutional arrangements to carry out these guidelines? And voluntary, they're non-binding and voluntary. So they're meant to be guidance. They're not meant to be prescriptive to countries. The process taught us that words, definitions, and consensus matter, and they matter a lot, which I was always very surprised about. Coming to consensus on what are healthy diets, what are unhealthy diets, what's the nutritious food, what are food systems, what are sustainable food systems. This language matters deeply to countries and was highly debated in the 300 hours of negotiation. Many of these words are political. They're contentious in countries. They call on different actors to step down and different actors to step up. So it's really these words are political, and consensus matters, and that's a big thing that we really learned in the guidelines. The guidelines are unique in that they set out principles of engagement, principles of inclusion, principles of what to focus on. Things like multi-sectoral evidence-based approaches, coherent, coordinated, inclusive policies, building transparency and participation in food system policies, gender empowerment, youth empowerment, elder people's empowerment, indigenous people's empowerment, and of course, linking human health and planetary health. The voluntary guidelines recognizes the complexity of food systems. I'm not going to go through this framework, but you can see there's many different aspects of food systems, many drivers, many actors that are acting at multiple levels and scales of food systems. And again, we're asking food systems to do a lot. There's many outcomes that result from food systems. And when you look at this complexity, it begs the question of, can we have it all? Can we ensure that food systems are doing everything we want them to do? The voluntary guidelines has 105 actions across 7 thematic themes. One is around governance. Another is around sustainable food supplies and how we can ensure food supplies are sustainable in the context of climate and COVID, a pandemic that will probably be with us now for a long time. Equal and equitable access to healthy diets. Food safety, again, bringing in pandemics, zoonotic diseases. People-centered nutrition knowledge, education, information. Gender equality, and youth are in there as well, and resilient food systems in humanitarian context. So it's broad, it's big, and it's bold in the number of actions across really everything that food systems touch on. Well, why should we care? And I pulled this from a World Bank document, another set of guidelines, the land tenure guidelines. And I like this quote. They talk about these guidelines and how they are a true global norm of reference in the governance of land tenure. And the guidelines outline principles and practices that governments can refer to in making their own laws and decisions in their countries. And I find this quite impactful and important, and the food systems voluntary guidelines are just the exact same way. They are an internationally negotiated soft law and set of guidelines to help policymakers navigate through this complex web called food systems and how food systems interact with every other system. So now the next step is coming together and figuring out how to realize these guidelines. And what we learned in this whole process, and I think Chris hopefully agrees with me, is that not everyone agrees with the guidelines, but every voice was heard. Everyone was heard and their concerns were heard. But we know that all actors need to engage in the process. It's so important for those voices to be heard. And their endorsement and carrying out of voluntary guidelines, it's essential that everyone is on board, or else they fall flat. They won't work. We also learned that evidence can vary by type. Many different kinds of evidence coming from different pockets of the planet. And it's interpreted in many different ways. And we've learned that sometimes the hard way. It's hard as an academic to swallow some of the evidence that's considered evidence. And the globalization, countries need to decide now which guidelines, which of those 107 are relevant for their context, how they'll enact them, who's going to be responsible for carrying those out, who's going to be held accountable, and what impact do they want to have when they fulfill these guidelines. But we need to grapple with many different elephants in the room to fulfill these guidelines, building a supportive political environment, investing, developing human capacity to work within food systems, cultivating social movements that push for equity and social justice, championing human rights, balancing power, and mitigating conflicts of interest that the food system is ripe with. So can we have a revolution? Can we have a food systems transformation? Well, we have the political momentum. The UN Food Systems Summit is this September, and that is an incredible moment to highlight the guidelines, but also to bring all the stakeholders together, again, engaging everyone in an inclusive way, in a rights-based way. But it's an important moment in the food systems world. Eyes are all looking at food systems and the players that are making decisions, and the voluntary guidelines will be a big discussion item in the summit. And of course, it depends on many things. And I'll stop just because I know we're running over time, but I really just want to emphasize that evidence and data are so key. And I think, as part of the HLPE that developed the report and helping CFS, Chris and Emilio and others in writing the guidelines, evidence and data are so powerful. And I feel that the voluntary guidelines were very much shaped by that in the beginning. Of course, governments have to have their voice and get consensus on language, but they're a powerful tool for decision-making, for bringing evidence-based decisions together and garnering political will and action. And I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for really pointing to a number of reasons why we need to care about the voluntary guidelines for food systems and nutrition. And so now, Maximo, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you will share with us, how to integrate this work in international organizations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure for me to join you today to add my voice to the discussion and FAO's contribution to the CFS Voluntary Guidelines on Food Systems and Nutrition. As all of you know, good nutrition is fundamental for reaching more than half of all Sustainable Development Goals, and healthy diets are a prerequisite to good nutrition. And the mission of FAO is to work in nutrition, is to tackle malnutrition in all its forms by accelerating impactful policies and actions across agri-food systems to enable healthy diets for all. The set of recommendations, including the Voluntary Guidelines on Food Systems and Nutrition, are a critical tool for FAO to complete its mission in nutrition and realize FAO's vision for nutrition, a world where all people are eating healthy diets from sustainable, inclusive, and resilient agri-food systems. The voluntary guidelines are essential for ensuring that the healthy diets needed for adequate nutrition are accessible, available, affordable, safe, and adequate quality and quantity, conforming with beliefs, culture, and traditions, dietary habits, and preferences of individuals. And let me stop there. A lot of words, a lot of complexities, and Jessica has mentioned that already. So we need to be very careful in what we bring up, and we need to be very careful that political discussions and confusion on concepts don't let science-driven evidence to decide where we need to go. I think the agreement on the guidelines was a great effort to come with a guideline, as it is called, and it's a voluntary guideline. But we need to complement all these guidelines with all the evidence and scientific evidence we need to put in place to be able to implement them properly. And that's where I see the role of international organizations to play. Just the element of having 105 actions and 7 themes is a huge complexity. But if you look carefully at the themes that was raised by Jessica, the core element behind that, and I think the central point, is equal access and equitable access to healthy diets, which today is not happening. Today we have 3 billion people that don't have access to healthy diets. And the number will be repeating. This year, you will see the number is very similar in the new SOFI, a state of food insecurity. So how we are able to achieve equal and equitable access to healthy diets? Everything turns around that. Now, if I look today at all the food being produced in the world, in terms just of calories, we are producing enough food in the world to satisfy all the calories needed in the world. Even more, if I do an accounting exercise, a mechanic accounting exercise, and see if I can, for example, be able to cover what is needed for a flexitarian diet, basically we have enough today in an accounting mechanic exercise to provide all what is needed for a flexitarian diet, which not necessarily is a healthy diet, but is the one mentioned by Lancet. So what that means? That means that the issue of access to healthy diets is not an issue of supply necessarily. It's an issue of distribution, it's an issue of behavior, and it's an issue of how people use and have access to these diets. And also it's an issue especially of having resources to be able to get and be able to afford these diets. And it is related also to the fact that healthy diets are too expensive. And it depends, of course, if they are local, if they are combinations with international products, and so on and so forth. But the fact is that today we don't have access to those diets. So for us, the timing of the adoption of the voluntary guidelines was very fortuitous because 2021 is a crucial year for nutrition, where all nutrition stakeholders, including FAO, have many opportunities to advocate at the highest political agendas for improving nutrition. The voluntary guidelines contribute to the current global debate in advance of not only the UN Food System Summit, but also the Tokyo Nutrition for Growth Summit. They offer an opportunity for all stakeholders to discuss more inclusive, sustainable, and resilient food systems for healthy diets for all. But again, we need to bring the science into it. We cannot have this type of discussions where words are confused. We don't have this type of discussions where we don't have clear definitions so that governments ain't following what science is saying. And that's central. So it's not only an issue of advocacy, it's an issue of advocacy, the best possible content. And I think that's the effort that has been done with the voluntary guidelines. And that's the effort that international organizations need to keep doing, together with universities, together with civil society, but to bring solid concepts of evidence so that we can really move forward properly and not waste time of people which today don't have access to food and they don't have access to healthy diets because we are confused with the definitions. So for me, these guidelines are central and I believe are a cornerstone for what we are going to do in international organizations. And we are going to complement as much as we can them with all the science evidence that is there so that we can move forward into increasing and finally finding a solution to the problem of access to healthy diets, which is not a simple problem, it's a complex problem. And we are even making it more complex because we are bringing in up another restriction, which is making sure that this availability of food for healthy diets is sustainable. And that's another complexity that is being transferred in certain way to the consumers. So we need to find an equitable solution for this. We need to find ways in which we can measure trade-offs because, as is clearly known, the countries which today face the biggest inequality are the countries which were the lower contributors to the problem of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions that we have today. So we have to find a solution that is equitable for all and not necessarily transfer all the trade-offs to the consumers, and especially consumers which today don't have access to healthy diets, so that we can resolve and really make these guidelines implementable and find finally the solution to have healthy diets for all. And FAO is really committed to working with you in partnership to translate this ambitious action. And I am very happy that the World Bank is here sponsoring this meeting because you are one of the key players in terms of the resources and in terms of the technical expertise that you have in the countries so that we can work together with other partners and other international organizations to achieve this goal. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Maximo, for just the pragmatism. Let's bring solid concepts of evidence to bear to find solutions rather than spend time, confused with the definitions, as you said. So I really appreciate that. Now we turn to Herda, the Sun Movement Coordinator. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Listra. And I first want to congratulate you and the team of World Bank and CFS who have organized this, because this is a great effort and it's a great success with having 120 World Bank representatives in country level, at regional level, and at global level involved. And what I'm hearing here is already promising. But let me start with explaining a little bit the Sun Movement and the strong partnership with the Committee on World Food Security. Not only because I've been a chair of the Committee on World Food Security, but also because global voluntary guidelines need to be implemented and need to be tailor-made to countries. Because this is where it all has to start, and this is where it has to be rooted and grounded. There is no one template, but it needs to be tailor-made at country level, bringing the government on board, but also making sure that all different sectors are engaged, and there are many in the food systems, but also the different stakeholders. Start with indeed bringing all the stakeholders around the table. My focus will be on not only on action, but on creating impact. And for that reason, I would like to praise the World Bank already for its activities so far at the country level. But I'd like to emphasize what I hope World Bank representatives do more or better. We have 64 member countries as Sun Movement, and the World Bank is one of our members from the very beginning. We are 10 years old, and brought together after Lancet report that said, you will never be able to end hunger and malnutrition because your siloed approach. You have a project here, you have a program there, and nutrition is crucial, but it's multifaceted in its character. And the second point was ending malnutrition can only be done if the politicians, if the government has the political will to do it. The same is the case with food systems. Only if the government is committed, only if the government is ready to provide the right leadership to this transformation, miracles will be happening. So my first ask to you is to support building the government ownership. As Sun Movement, we have shared the 2-pager on the voluntary guidelines, and I can only recommend them to you, to all Sun Movement focal points, to all multi-sectoral and multi-stakeholder networks at country level, encouraging all the stakeholders to be there when the country food systems dialogues are organized. Because, as I said, there is no one country you can just duplicate a food system from another country. It depends on where a country is, what the opportunities are, of course, soil, water, natural resources, but also culture and food and nutrition behavior. So this is one of the things. The World Bank can be very powerful to encourage the government to take this leadership and make it a really multi-sectoral approach where the KPIs of the key performance indicators of the different ministers are grouped around working together on food systems change that we all want to see. So my second request to you is to be also there when it comes to the connection between the different stakeholders, the government, and the evidence base. Because I agree with what Maximo and yes, Frenzo have said, you cannot just start, but you need to have an evidence-based approach building upon where you are and make sure that things are clear. However, very often there is a huge disconnect between research and evidence and the policy advisors and the policy decision makers. That is something that we experience very often at the country level, and that will be multiplied when we talk about food systems. For instance, very often we see that food is dealt with by the Minister of Agriculture, and then the Minister of Agriculture is talking about food security, also thinking that then nutrition security is covered. And the thinking there is too often only on calories, not on the nutritious needs that needs to be covered to nourish people and make them productive and to also take care of our planet. So please be there also when it comes to making the connection between research and science and knowledge and to inform clear policies. My third ask is because you're such an important player at all levels, make sure that a government is putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to transforming food systems. We all realize that there will be a lack of investment potential due to the impact of COVID. Nevertheless, strong ownership of a government and involvement of the parliament as well will start by investing from the domestic budget. And then I would like to ask the World Bank to also play a role in making sure that other financial investors, funds, banks, donors are investing as one, aligned behind the government from different angles. Because right now we have a lot of siloed funds, one for climate change, one for biodiversity, one for maybe nutrition, one for something else. But if they all stick in their siloed approach, then it won't be, you won't get the clearinghouse approach or the blended approach that is so much needed to make the food systems change in such a balanced way. So here are my three concrete asks, and once more, read the two-pager and then start to study the voluntary guidelines, because the language sometimes is very complicated, but with these 7 points, it's crystal clear where to go at the country level. In many countries where there is already a food systems dialogues, the 7 points of the CFS are brought up, and they are really working to guide and inform the conversations that are organized, are held with all stakeholders around the table. Thanks once more, compliments, and back to you, Listra.
Thank you so much, Hera, for those three concrete asks of the World Bank. And so we hope that the colleagues who are discussants, senior World Bank staff members who will now respond to what they've heard, will also perhaps address some of the things that you mentioned. And so we have Mira Shekar, who is the Global Lead Nutrition, Health, and Nutrition Global Practice within the World Bank.
And she is the chair of our executive committee, yeah?
Ah, excellent.
The Sun Movement Executive Committee.
Exactly. And we also have Gayatri Acharya, Sector Leader, Sustainable Development, South Asia Region of the bank. And we have Diego Arias, who is a lead agriculture economist within the Agriculture and Food Global Practice and is working on the Africa region within the World Bank. So welcome to each of you. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to start off with you, Mira, just to provide a sense for what you've heard from this morning. Just give us your feedback, especially as well, how in your area, health and nutrition, you see scope for the guidelines.
Great, thank you very much, Listra, and thank you to all the speakers. This has been very interesting conversation. And as Listra said, I'm with the World Bank, but I also wear this other hat of being, as Gerda reminded us, the chair for the Sun Executive Committee. And just to go back to history, 10 years ago, we actually created the Sun Movement. The bank was a key creator, and we launched it at the spring meetings of the World Bank in 2010. So I'm going to focus on a couple of key words that have been mentioned and how to translate them from ambition to action, which really is the issue that we're all focusing on. As Martine said, from people, planet, and economy. Those are the three agendas that we really are focusing on. As we get into the implementation, I just want to remind this audience, as Chris had suggested right at the beginning, about the scale of the issues. So we know 140, from a nutrition point of view, 149 million children across the world are stunted. Means their brains are stunted for life, and they will be much less productive in terms of the economy. In addition, as Maximo mentioned, 2 billion people who are micronutrient deficient. At the same time, 40% of the world population, more than 40%, in fact, is either overweight or obese. And though we tend to think that obesity is a problem of the rich in the rich countries, actually, if you look at some of the work that we did on a report called Health and Economic Consequences of Obesity, actually more than 70% of these overweight, obese individuals, both kids and adults, live in low or middle income countries. And those are the bank's client countries. So this is an area we have not done enough in up to now, to be honest. We are just starting to get going on this approach. And as we move into this approach, as several of you have indicated, we want to bring in what we refer to as a whole of World Bank approach. And as you might have noticed, Martin doesn't talk about food security alone, even though he belongs in the agriculture sector. He talks about food and nutrition security. In our briefing for the board on Friday, we're focusing on food and nutrition security. We use that terminology, which is new, and that is also something in the voluntary guidelines. We also have focused extensively on human capital, as Martin said. That really has helped to bring the agenda forward. And we are working across agriculture, health, nutrition that I work with, but also our social protection team, our transport team, our water and sanitation team, and even our treasury team is working with us to do financing for nutrition and food security. So coming to the guidelines, it's wonderful to see what is included in there, a strong focus on labeling, nutrition labeling, strong focus on nutrition education. But I also want to remind us, as Chris will remember I did at the, when these were being discussed, things that are not included in there. And among them are issues around taxation, it's not included, processed foods, ultra-processed foods, not included. And think about the fact that actually 42 plus countries are already implementing taxation, taxes on either sugar-sweetened beverages or the like. And I don't know how many of you saw Cristiano Ronaldo yesterday, the Portuguese soccer player who took off the Coke bottles and put them down and brought a bottle of water instead and drink this. Really, really good to see this sort of action. So in terms of what the bank can do, we have multiple instruments. We are working with development policy operations that basically incentivize countries to change policies. So it's not just investment lending, but policy operations that can be incentivized. I can go on and on forever, this, as everyone knows, and I know time is short. So let me end with a couple of, well, two thoughts. First, as several of you have indicated, evidence and data are very powerful, and those are absolutely critical as we move towards action. Hoda knows how much I have pushed in the SUN 3.0 strategy to focus on evidence, evidence, evidence. If we are not able to achieve impact, we will be completely unsuccessful. So going from the voluntary guidelines, 107 of them, to action at the country level, we really need to focus on what the evidence is telling us. And Jessica reminded us of that as well. Because evidence will mean impact. And my last comment is around my sort of latest and perhaps biggest passion at the moment, excuse me, which is nutrition financing. And we talk about the need for more money for nutrition. That's my mantra. We need more money for nutrition, but we also need more nutrition, need to get more nutrition out of the money that is being spent. And that means focusing on evidence. Again, But also that means, as Martin referred to it, and Jürgen Wogle, our vice president for the social development team, mentions many a time, it means getting more money out of what is being spent, for example, on agricultural subsidies in many countries. Can those be repurposed to get better impact? And those are the sorts of things that we are focusing on as the bank across the World Bank Group. Those are the sorts of issues we will bring up at the UN Food Systems Summit that is coming up, but also none of you have mentioned the Nutrition for Growth Summit that is coming very soon as well, or maybe I didn't hear it. And that's coming up at the end of the year. We anticipate pledges, and we really want from both overseas development aid, but also government and the private sector. And I think at the moment, we really have not called out the role of the private sector, given that our food systems are really dominated by the private sector. Yes, Listra, I'm just finishing. I just want to remind everybody else of one other thing, which is if you look at the food system and the role of the private sector, you've seen the reports that 70% of the foods that Nestle, a company like Nestle, is selling are unhealthy and they cannot be reformulated. We've also seen that 4.4% of the food that is packaged foods that is sold in India is actually unhealthy. Only 4.4% is healthy. So the rest, 95+% is actually unhealthy. So without addressing this through these voluntary guidelines, as countries translate from ambition to action, we will not be able to achieve it. So great opportunity, but huge challenges as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira. And thanks also for addressing that question that was actually posed in the chat and the question and answer function, which asked, what can the private sector do? So you provided one lens into that answer. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Gayatri. And Gayatri, you've been working in South Asia. Do you want to give us a bit of example, some context for what's happening and how the guidelines are being used in the operations that you do in South Asia?
Thanks very much. Thank you, Listra. Thank you for inviting me. This is, one reads documents, but it never comes to life until you have a conversation like this. So I really appreciate all the speakers that came before and some of the questions that are in the chat box as well. So, if I reflect back to as Mira was reminding us, when Sun started 10 years ago, we weren't even talking about food and nutritional security in the same breath. And I think it's remarkable that we do this without thinking much about it anymore. It's sort of, as Martin, it sort of was speaking, it's just natural. And all of us speak about this as one thing because that nudge has taken place in our brains. And I think that, the bank's programs of support, and I look at it from purely an operational perspective, are really well positioned to take on this joint together multi-sector approach that is advocated by these guidelines and by the associated programs. Why? Because I think that these principles that address health and sustainable food systems are aligned with most of our sector policies, let's say, most of our dialogue. Everybody talks about doing these things. And we can find common ground to work along these principles that are well articulated in these guidelines with colleagues across human development programs and sustainable development programs. And increasingly we have examples, right? We have more analytics, we have more evidence because of colleagues who've been hammering away and asking for more evidence over the years. These provide benchmarking. They tell us, most recently in South Asia, now that I've been working here most recently, we have benchmarking for the cost of healthy diets across South Asia. This gives us some talking points, gives us an ability to engage our clients. Projects are increasingly co-created and co-managed with colleagues who are working on human development, on health, on social protection, even on finance and competitiveness, right? And that means that we start to bring together that nudge, that behavioral nudge that hopefully we've internalized into the design of these programs, and orient them to improve diets, improve the way, for example, we do market redevelopment. Urban programs do market redevelopment, agriculture programs do market redevelopment. And in the past, we may not have consciously taken on food safety considerations. We may not have consciously taken on the access issues, whether farmers have access, whether small farmers have access, whether there's space within that market framework to recognize what's a healthy product versus an unhealthy product, etc. These conversations are now happening in the context of programs being designed. Similarly, safety net responses that increasingly address not just access to food, but access to affordable and nutritional food. And that means that we have a space as the agriculture team as well to help define a little bit what that means. Where does it come from? What are the backward linkages that make sure that the supply of that nutritional food will be maintained to wherever it needs to go? We are also, increasingly, I think, coming around to understanding that concepts such as Nutri Gardens may not always be the solution. In some countries they work, in some countries they don't, as Hedda was saying. It is simply, it has to be what works for that country and that context. In South Asia, we find that actually there's a huge uptake of these small scale gardens. And they have multiple impacts, not just that there is increased vegetable production and access to vegetables, but gives a little bit more independence to the community groups, to the women. It has multiple other kinds of values, let's say, that are worth it. But the evidence on this needs to be developed further. And finally, I think, just as an example, the increasing use of what we are calling Nutri enterprises. This is a very large area of work in South Asia. Take-home rations, ways in which that communities can contribute to what is increasingly defined and understood as a better diet, right? So not for agriculture, not to get into the space of defining what that is, for certainly those who are, more knowledgeable about what is a good diet, what is a good take-home ration to create that evidence. But then for other parts of the bank to come in and support the supply chain associated with those foods. So in my mind, we need to agree to this code of conduct, and then we will find more opportunities. And if we keep on walking down this road of agreeing to this code of conduct, I am absolutely convinced that we will create more and more of these multi-sector programs with that single objective of enabling safe and healthy diets, right? So the objective must be one. We can have multiple ways leading to it. So what are these opportunities? Very quickly, I can say in South Asia.
Very quickly, just 1 minute, one more minute.
Yes, very, very super fast. We have a lot of institutions, farmer groups, community groups, etc. We can leverage them. We can use them as champions for some of this work. Awareness and evidence. There's much more awareness of this. The fact that, domestic productivity loss due to unsafe food in South Asia, in India, is estimated at $15 billion US dollars should matter. And that should become a way in which we can, ask for actions or promote actions. Technology. Sometimes the solutions are complex, but the solutions may not be. Food loss sometimes can be supported through, relatively simple technological improvements. There's a food storage project in Bangladesh, for example. It's not tackling, it's food storage. I mean, it sounds like it's a standard kind of a program, but it's bringing in new technology so it reduces waste. Simple things like that, I think we can do much more in. And finally, new allies. We've been advocating, working on health together with agriculture, but we've also been advocating working on urban food systems. We need to work with urban planners. We need to work with transport. We need to work with local governments much more to be able to use spaces within urban areas, but also to reduce the waste that takes place and makes access to good food that much more difficult. And so I think that, you know, ultimately we need to find a way to facilitate this multi-sector dialogue, which we can do. So, and I think the voluntary guidelines are a great tool. We can't cut this Gordian knot. It's not the way it's going to work. The political economy issues are too great. We have to be able to unravel it. And I love the fact that there are so many ideas in the guidelines. And I think we have, you know, therefore many ways in which we can start this process of unraveling this difficult problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gayatri, for sharing with us what are some of the things that are happening in South Asia. And so now we have Diego, who's going to focus on what's happening in Africa. So Diego, yours is the task to really be crisp. I'm going to hold you to that 4 to 5 minutes so that we can answer some of the questions in the chat. Over to you.
Thank you, Listra, and thanks for inviting me. And again, congratulations to the CFS for the great work. This is really what's needed to raise the level of political engagement at a global scale on this topic. It's very difficult for us who work at a country level on operations, on projects, if there's not that buy-in. So if the countries have signed up to these guidelines, it does help in the discussion, especially because this discussion involves several ministries at the country level. That's never easy. And nutrition definitely is not a priority often of our ministries of agriculture. Even health ministries have trouble prioritizing investments in that. So this is really helpful. I would like to highlight a few I would say good examples of what is being done in Africa, and then leave for the discussion a few points on what I think at the operational level we could do more of. I've seen 3 types, I would say, of operations in Africa that are very much aligned and could be replicated elsewhere. In terms of the context of these new guidelines. One is in Rwanda, where there's this program approach to agriculture, food and nutrition that it's working quite well. It's a combination of social protection, health, water, and agriculture, which has been, as Mira mentioned, the evidence behind what drives nutrition outcomes. And these are not programs that are fully integrated. They use the co-location approach, but it is a common understanding at a high political level in the country that these are outcomes to be achieved. And so all the different ministries and programs are aligned and help target in a geographic area these nutrition outcomes. That's one example. There's others, but I just mentioned that one. There's also another approach that's more for maybe situations of FCV countries in crisis, conflict, where instead of co-location, there's co-targeting of those families that need to have those nutrition outcomes reversed. And so there is, in DRC, for example, there's a co-targeting effort on a multi-sectoral project. And again, it involves targeting those same families, not necessarily the same areas, but the same families through programs. It's a little bit more complex and difficult to do, but it does provide a good example of what can be done. And then the third one is something maybe to qualify Maximo's point on the supply side, where I work in the agriculture and food department, so our client is mainly the Ministry of Agriculture, in making our ministers of agriculture realize that nutrition is in their interest. Very much like we did with climate 2 decades ago, when the ministers of agriculture did not think that climate was in their purview of action. Now with nutrition, there is that opportunity for them to take, I would say, unilateral action from the own ministry to integrate nutrition into agriculture policies and programs. And this is being done in Ethiopia and Mozambique, where the concept of nutrition smart agriculture is taking hold within the ministries of agriculture. The thought that I would like to leave, Listra, with everybody for the discussion is that given the importance that nutrition is having and has had on COVID deaths, so we know that nutrition is important overall for health, for human health, but given the importance that it has taken on COVID and more evidence on that would also help urgent action, would be our countries in Africa, but I think globally, because of budgetary constraints, are more and more requesting lending for policy reforms. And we observe many countries where I would say unhealthy foods or elements of foods are being produced. They do have incentives that go against the policies that the health sector is putting into place. So aligning both agriculture with health policies as well as social protection would go a long way. So the opportunity, I think, it's not just to think about lending and financing for investments, but also for policy reforms. And here is an area I think that it could be very much an advantage for us to include in all those COVID recovery operations that will provide budget support, but that could have a link to policy reforms in this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego. Much appreciated. I'm going to jump right into one of the questions that we see here. It says, what is a healthy product? And the person goes on, it says, this is not a nutritionally balanced food because no food is nutritionally balanced except breast milk. If not, it would suffice to eat always the same food during all of life. A healthy food is therefore simply real food, preferably minimally processed to keep all its health properties, including the matrix effect. So in a sense, this question was asked and answered, but I'm curious, who wants to take this on? What is a healthy product? Very short, so we can get to another question. Okay, now don't let me have to call you out.
So let me get started, Listra. I think there is not a healthy food that will satisfy all the nutrient needs for a human being. Breast milk is an exception, and it's only for a certain phase of one's life. There are many healthy foods out there. Healthy foods meaning essentially foods that have good nutrients in them. It doesn't mean all the nutrients in one food, but those can be combined with other foods. That's why we talk about balanced diets, bringing in different foods that complement each other. But also healthy foods are foods that do not have additives that are harmful to human health. And that's where one of the questions around ultra-processed foods was about that as well. Why are they some foods bad for you? Not just because they are not nutritive, but also because they have these additives that actually have been known to cause cancers and several other what we refer to as non-communicable diseases. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira. Anyone else wanting to add anything to Mira's response? Okay, going once, going twice. So another thing that came up, we heard today that, and Maximo mentioned that we really need to focus on equal and equitable access to healthy diets. So now in the context of our World Bank projects and what is being done at the country level on the ground, I'm curious, how receptive have governments been to this agenda, equal and equitable access to healthy diets?
If you allow me, Listra, to jump in here, this is Gerda speaking.
Yes, sure.
Not enough, because as I said in my contribution, too often and too long, we have looked at food and nutrition security as a separate topic. We have looked at nutrition for people and nutrition for our planet in a separate way, and the same counts for and what is needed to create a prosperous future or a well-nourished economy, as Martin van Nieuwkoop told it. But we have learned also through the crisis that a siloed approach will not do the trick. At no level, not at the World Bank level, not at the country level. And this was already sorted out 10 years ago for nutrition, but now it is broadening up. And now we are discussing the broader topic of food systems. So we can blame countries for it and government, and if we want, we can do it. It's not a constructive way. The constructive way is to get the dialogue started and to convince and create ownership at the country level with a political leadership, because solutions need to be country owned and country driven. So my suggestion is, let's take the positive side and let us realize what the opportunity is of transforming food systems, because if we get food systems right, we will be easily able to deal with all other sustainable development goals, because we understand the systemic approach that is needed.
Great, thank you, Gerda. So on that, there's a question. Can someone discuss the role of livestock and animal source food in delivering nutrition, especially to special needs of children?
Of course.
Yes, Diego, Gayatri?
Yes. So you know, in a global scenario, no, it's very difficult to talking about what's healthy and what's it's needed. Here it is clear that a multi-sectoral approach is needed. Without that, we won't go anywhere. And it's not useful, as Gerda mentioned, to shame. It's not constructive. I think that in this case, and in particular in the case of livestock, which has been quite controversial because it does create some problems when it's overconsumed, but it's an important source of protein for others. It is critical that each actor within countries, and I'm talking about sectors, agriculture, health, social protection, they all understand what their role is in terms of supporting this type of products. So if the agriculture ministry thinks, oh, we're going to produce livestock to just generate incomes for our farmers without understanding what implications that has for the local population in terms of nutrition, be it positive, be it negative, it is going to be hard to shift, the relative prices, to shift the preferences if it's readily available or not. So I think each individual sector has to come to understanding the impact that it has in terms of their contribution to nutrition, even though the action has to be joint. So in the case of livestock, I would say that it depends on the local population, but understanding trade and the incentives that each government provides its own livestock sector is critical to meet that goal, be it at the level of those families that or segment of the population that needs that protein and those nutrients that come from meat.
Thank you so much, Diego. And Jessica, I know you have to leave in 1 minute. If there was one thing you wanted to say in closing as you go, what would that be?
Oh, well, yeah, I was going to talk about livestock. Livestock and animal source foods is going to be one of the biggest contentious issues coming into the summit. And of course, we know that there's some places in the world where people consume way too much meat and other places that don't get enough. So there's a real equity issue, but we know that livestock systems need to transform. And there's a lot of work being done by private sector, by the livestock industry to transform livestock systems. And that, means sustainable intensification of systems, paying attention on animal welfare, food feed, circular issues, blue water use. But this will be probably one of the most contentious issues, as the Eat Lancet saw in the aftermath of its publication, and that most countries and policymakers are quite confused about that space. So I think, and the voluntary guidelines, again, tries to address some of that inequity that we see in animal source foods as much as they could in a consensus type document. But that will be a critically important topic, along with ag subsidies and trade issues. As Mira said, the ultra processed food space is another big one. These are really contentious political issues that played out in the voluntary guideline negotiations, but will continue to leading up to the summit as well. So, but thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And feel free to drop off. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it. And so let me turn, as we close, to Chris. Chris, final words from you?
Well, just a big thank you. We've got some real talent here. We've got 118 people, I think I counted at one point. So it's an important group that we are going to rely on. In terms of my original request, it's really about support for CFS and its guidelines. Just thinking the World Bank is going to support us is not enough. It's actually you individually, when you get to a dialogue, a meeting, a food summit, independent dialogue. It's not enough to say, oh, I guess the bank supports this. No, you need to bring it up. Please get the conversation going at government level, national level. As Gerda said, we really need action to get the networks linked, to start talking about these issues, the national dialogues, formatting along those 7 categories of issues that are covered by the guidelines are a helpful way to organize those discussions. And again, lots of questions. We're leaving some on the table just in the based on the short time we have. But I really want to thank everybody who helped put this together and joined us, particularly early in the morning. So thanks again, World Bank. We need you. We look forward to working with you, and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. And just a few closing words from me. Thanks to all of the presenters and our discussants, and of course to the organizing team that put this together. Led by Astrid. We really appreciate it. There are some links that have been put in the chat for our participants, but we heard a lot of things today. We heard Martine say that the agriculture portfolio per year is about 4 billion and currently existing portfolio about 20 billion. It certainly is a place where, as we've heard multiple speakers say today, given the voluntary guidelines, that a multi-sectoral approach is necessary. And the bank's role, both in terms of its lending, in terms of its advice to countries, and also its ability to really tee up these discussions and support the importance of these guidelines for aligning policies to investments. We heard that completely throughout the morning. We also heard that we need to get more nutrition for the dollar spent. I hope that today, with what you've heard, you certainly see the commitment of the World Bank in implementing and promoting these voluntary guidelines, as we have discussions with our country partners who really need to be in the driver's seat, as we've heard all morning, but together with stakeholders such as yourselves, the bank is and continues to be fully supportive and engaged on ensuring that this agenda gets the attention that it deserves as we go forward. So thank you so much to all of our participants this morning. Thank you for joining. And on behalf of our organizing committee, I just want to say, have a wonderful day and thank you to all.